Hi everybody, and a big welcome to everyone this morning. It's fantastic to see so many of you attending this webinar, which is hosted by the British Educational Research Association, that's BERA. I'm Dr. Barbara Skinner. I'm a senior lecturer in education at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. And I'm also joint convener of BERA's Language and Literacy Special Interest Group. I'll be hosting today's webinar, which asks, is phonics the only game in town? Recently, phonics has been accepted as the prime approach to the teaching and learning of reading. And today's speakers explore that view. They present research on different perspectives on the use and impact of phonics. We've got some great speakers lined up for you this morning. First up is Liz Zargo. She is from the University of Huddersfield and is a senior lecturer in primary education. And Liz will be talking about children's perspectives on the use of phonics. Second set of speakers is Professor Annette Woods from Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and Dr. Asper Baroutsis, a postdoctoral research fellow at Griffith University, also in Queensland, Australia. They're going to be looking at public debates in Australia around the use of phonics. Our third speakers are Suzanne Graham, who is Professor of Language and Education at the University of Reading, and Robert Woor, who's an Associate Professor in Applied Linguistics at Oxford University. And they'll be exploring the effects of teaching phonics for second language learners of French. Last up is Dr. Janet Soler from the Open University. Janet's a senior lecturer there, and we'll be looking at the commodification of phonics, especially exploring how early years literacy has become a big commercial business. So first up, we have Liz Zargo, who will be talking about children's perspectives on the use of phonics.
Hello, good morning, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to be here with you today. And thank you for the chance to share my research with you. So this is the research that I've been carrying out as part of my doctoral work. And it's about young children's views on learning to read in the context of systematic synthetic phonics as the prime approach. So the research questions that I set out to answer are here on the screen now. So what I wanted to know is, what are children's experiences and perceptions of learning to read and reading overall in the current context, the current policy context, and how might these experiences and perceptions be influencing their development as readers overall? So just to explain my background and why I was interested in these questions. So I was a primary school teacher for a long time and a primary head teacher. I was very convinced of and remain convinced of the benefits of phonics for children when they're learning to read as an important strand in the teaching of early reading. At the same time, I also worked at DFE for a little while, and I could see the kind of policy levers that were being brought into play and the seismic policy shifts really that were happening in terms of every single lever being activated in quite an unprecedented way, from initial teacher training to match funding to the phonics screening check to Ofsted frameworks, and then observing what was happening as a result as I was visiting schools and also reading the views of people, Margaret Clark, people like that, Henrietta Dombey, Ruth Miskin, government ministers. So everybody, it seems, has a view on the teaching of early reading and of the place of phonics within that. But I felt that I've always been interested in finding out children's views on the ways that we're teaching them and how that can really help us when we are trying to improve what we do for children. And I thought that what we really needed to do was try and find out what all of this was like from a children's perspective. So that was what I set out to do. So how did I do that? So this is a small scale interpretive study. So that means it's 24 children altogether, 7 groups of children, and it's a qualitative study. So I've asked children and then thought about what they've said, what they've done, and what that might mean. I interviewed the children in both year 1 and year 2, so there was a small longitudinal element to the study. I interviewed children in 3 different schools and across different classes within those schools, because I was trying to reduce the effect of how, you know, any one particular teacher or one particular school's approach, and find out more generally what children's views might be. And I interviewed each group 3 times across the course of the research. I used activity-oriented group interviews. Because these are very young children that I was talking to, I felt that the use of groups helped to some extent to mitigate the power differentials, and the activity-based nature of what we were doing helped to reduce the interrogative nature of asking children about what they think about things. So there were lots of opportunities for children to do things, but also incidental chat alongside what they were doing between themselves and with me. So I felt that that would help them to talk more about what their views were. And I based it on a method called the mosaic approach. I drew from that. It wasn't a pure mosaic approach, enabling children to express themselves in lots of different ways, which I will show in a moment. I circled around the questions in a number of different ways, and I also returned to some of the questions in later interviews, so that we were able to explore changes in children's views over time to some extent. So here are some of the activities that I carried out with children. I thought it'd be interesting to share some of these with you. So I'll talk you through what some of these are. So up at the top here, we've got Pickle and Boo. So Pickle and Boo were soft toy characters who held really quite different views about reading and about phonics. So Pickle maybe really liked reading, and Boo maybe didn't like reading. And Pickle maybe thought he was good at reading or good at phonics, and Boo maybe thought the opposite to that. So children were introduced to these characters, and then they were asked to say whether they thought they were more similar to Pickle or more similar to Boo. So that was one of the ways that we work with children, and then talking about why that was, why they'd chosen that particular answer. We also did work with emoticons that we've got in the middle here. So we asked children about, or I asked children about things like when they're reading their own books at home, how they feel, when they're reading their school book at home, their school book at school, when they're doing phonics at school. And you can see here there are different answers, and that's because we went back with the same emoticons in year 1 and then in year 2. So the ones that are coloured in pencil are from year 1, and then the answers where they've circled around with a felt pen, that was in year 2. So we were also then able to get into discussions, or I was, about how their views had changed over time, and say to them, oh, well, last time you said this and now you've said that, why do you think that is? And we've got some really interesting answers to that. Children were also asked to draw a time when they remembered themselves being really happy, feeling really positive reading. So that's an example of one of the drawings, a child reading with their friends in the reading corner and acting out a story. We used an unfinished picture technique. So this is a picture of a phonics lesson, but you can see it's quite sort of neutrally presented. And then a picture here of a child reading with an adult. And so questions around that could be, well, what do you think's happening in this picture? What do you think the teacher's saying? What do you think the children are saying? What do you think the teacher's thinking? What are the children thinking? And again, some really interesting responses to that. I also used blob tree activities. So I'm sure lots of you are familiar with blob trees. So trees where you have characters showing lots of different expressions and moods. And I said, which one's most like you when you're reading at home or reading at school or doing phonics or whatever? And children chose and discussed why they'd chosen particular figures. And I also asked children to write a set of instructions for a toy animal, Rusty the dog, about how Rusty needed to read. So some instructions for Rusty about how to read. And you can see the examples down at the bottom there of one of the activities, of one of the responses. Also, there were other activities, such as within each session, there was some time for children to engage with books. So on some occasions, school reading books, on some occasions, books they brought in from home, or books that I brought along. So there was always some kind of an opportunity to engage with books, so that I could see how they engaged with them. I observed the children, and then they talked about whichever book it was that they'd chosen to read. So a whole range of different activities. So when I say it's drawing from the mosaic approach, that's what I mean, that we were circling around these same questions and same issues in lots of different ways. Okay, so what were the findings then? So these were some of the things that came out of it. So one finding was that children have a really strong awareness of phonics as a subject, a very strong awareness, and often seem to see it as conceptually actually separate from and different to reading or English or literacy or anything else that they do. So conceptually, children have this understanding of phonics. Bradbury calls it phonics with a capital P, and that's absolutely right. Children definitely demonstrated that. Where they were able to make links to other subjects, this was generally to writing. So children saw a link between phonics and writing and talked about doing writing in their phonics lessons, but much more rarely between phonics and reading when they talked about it. In terms of the enactment of reading, however, what children actually did when they were reading, or told me that they did when they were reading, or told Rusty what to do when he was reading, children really focus very much then on decoding. So children in their enactment seem to see reading as decoding. And good reading was regarded as a matter of proficiency in decoding. So following on from that, children saw successful readers, whether themselves or others within the class, as being those who were successful at decoding. So in other words, good readers get it right. Good readers can decode correctly. So it was very much a performance model of whether or not they thought that they were able to read. And following on from that, and this is where, you know, the interpretation comes in, and we know that classrooms are hugely complex places. Learning to read is multifactorial. All sorts of influences are going on with children and their learning to read in their lives. So there is no kind of very strong cause and effect, but it was definitely the case that successful decoders often seem to report more positive feelings about reading over time, whereas the children who saw themselves as unsuccessful at decoding seem to report more negative feelings about reading over time. When children were asked what reading was for or why they were learning to read as well, the instrumental view of why they were learning to read seemed to come out the most strongly. So that I'm reading for learning, I'm reading so I can get better in my other subjects, that sort of thing. So an instrumental view of reading seemed to be extremely strong in children. Children also reported increasingly less time for reading in school outside of the reading scheme work that they were doing. And that was visible in year 1, but it was much stronger by the time they got into year 2. Now, I'm sure a lot of teachers would say, and the teachers of these children did say, but they are reading, we're doing shared reading, we're reading to them. But this is about the children's perceptions. And they often said things like, well, we don't have time to read anymore in school. I never get to read because I don't finish my work in time. So those were very frequent comments from the children in terms of their perceptions. And also, I haven't put it on here, but it's also relevant that children were very aware of their position within the class in terms of hierarchy, the hierarchy of reading. Now, that's not a new finding. That has been the case ever since, you know, reading has been done. Reading schemes have been in place. It's not a new finding at all. But now with many reading schemes in schools being based on children's proficiency in systematic synthetic phonics, their decodable reading schemes. Therefore, the hierarchy in the class, the hierarchy in the children's minds was often based on who was good at decoding, who wasn't good at decoding. And finally, and I found this really interesting, some children seem to view sharing books or being read to as only being for poor readers. So they seem to see reading by themselves as being the absolute aim. That's what they wanted to be able to do. And if somebody had to read to them, or they were sharing a book with a parent or a teacher, that was a sign that they weren't good at reading and they wanted to get past that stage. I was quite surprised by that. So I thought it would be helpful to just do a few vignettes for you, because I've made all of these sweeping statements, but we know, don't we, that in terms of qualitative research, it's not really possible in any conclusive way to make these to draw these conclusions. And it's important to understand the complexity of individual experiences within that. So I thought the vignettes would help us to do this. So this is Ethan, and Ethan in year 1 reported that he enjoyed reading books that he'd chosen at home and at school, and he enjoyed reading by himself and with his parents and with his friends as well. He didn't enjoy reading his school reading books, and you can see the comment that he made there about that. He didn't like having to do it, he thought it was boring, and he definitely saw himself as not good at phonics. That came through quite strongly. In year 2, so he still didn't like phonics, he saw it as hard and as boring. He definitely viewed reading as a matter of decoding proficiency, but he was very resistant to that in year 2. And he said, by this stage, I don't read, I look at the pictures. So we didn't consider any other method of interacting with a text as reading. Reading was about decoding. He didn't read, he didn't want to do that, he just looked at the pictures. And Ethan, by year 2, no longer enjoyed reading his own books at home either. He didn't want to read them anymore, and you can see his comment there. So that's Ethan. And it's really interesting because the National Literacy Trust do annual surveys that consistently show that children of this age have the most enjoyment in reading. So this is when enjoyment of reading really should be at its high point. Although when they did a survey of children aged 5 to 8, I think it was last year, around 30% of young children in that age group said that they only read if they had to. So Ethan seems to be perhaps representative of that group of children. So we've got Scarlett next. Scarlett was a more mixed picture. So Scarlett enjoyed reading her own books and her school reading books at home with her mummy in year 1. But she said she felt nervous when she was reading at school with a teacher. She liked doing phonics when she got it right, but not when she got stuck. And she definitely viewed herself as not very good at reading because she didn't know the words, is what she said. In year 2, she still enjoyed reading at home, and she could talk in great detail about her favourite book. She drew me a picture of one of her favourite illustrations from her favourite book, told me all about it. She didn't enjoy reading a school reading book at home anymore. She wanted to play on her phone. She didn't enjoy phonics anymore. She found it hard. And her view of reading was strongly based on being able to decode. So clearly Scarlett is a child that's very concerned about getting it right or getting it wrong. So the proficiency is important to her. There are signs that her reading is very much based in a performance model. So it remains to be seen whether she will maintain that enjoyment of reading outside of school. And then let's finish on a high. So we've got Logan here. So Logan spoke with huge enthusiasm about reading in school and at home. He absolutely loved reading. He liked doing phonics. You can see here he linked it to writing, but he enjoyed doing it. By year 2, he felt even more positive about reading his school books. He was doing well at it. He thought it was great because the books were bigger. They got 49 pages. The words were longer. He enjoyed doing phonics and he felt successful at it. He likes learning sounds. He put it as really happy. He circled the happy face about 10 times. But he didn't like reading his school book at school with his teacher. So this is an example of a child who felt like, you know, he was little and he didn't know how to read. He liked reading on his own. Okay. Right, let's move on. So what are the implications here? And I realised when I wrote this, really, I should have put implications with a question mark, because, you know, these are some things I'm tentatively drawing out of it, but perhaps there are others. Perhaps you can help me with that. I haven't written up this, I've not written the conclusion of my doctorate yet, so maybe some of the comments today will really help with this part. So one of the implications is probably about making links between phonics and other domains of learning to try and break down some of these very, very strong classifications between the different subjects in children's minds, so that children see the value of phonics and how that links with the reading that they're doing. Also, to make sure that we continue to emphasise for children that reading can be engagement with text on all levels in lots of different ways. So although, you know, decoding may be important and you might think it's this important or this important, this isn't really about that. But nonetheless, it's still important that children understand reading, its engagement with text in lots of different ways. Continued emphasis on high quality literature in school so that children are not experiencing that drop off if they're not reading at home anymore, they're not enjoying doing that, and they don't really want to read the reading books at schools being sent home, which by the way was the least popular activity of everything. Then that high quality literature, the exposure to that in school is so important. And then continued opportunities within a school setting for children to choose text and spend time reading for pleasure. So to have that choice and to have that time, I know how hard it is. I've been a teacher, but building that in, because that is such an important strand of them learning to read. And reading, as Logan said, as amazing, as fun, enriching, fulfilling, exciting, all of those different things. I've got a little picture here of the elephant in the room, which is the phonics screening check, which I haven't mentioned at all. But of course, we know, don't we, and I know because I spend a lot of time in schools in my current role, that the phonics screening check inevitably has a huge impact on what teachers are doing. And you might think that's a really good thing, you might think that's not such a good thing, but nonetheless, I think we can all agree that there is a huge impact of the phonics screening check. And when teachers know that they have that kind of accountability coming up, and then it's easy to let that one aspect become the most important aspect, and for other aspects to be the ones that can perhaps drop off a little bit. So that's why I put at the bottom a rebalance of the early reading curriculum. That's not about whether we should or shouldn't be doing phonics. I'm not talking about multi-cueing or anything like that. What I'm talking about is making sure that early reading is not just about phonics and decoding, but the whole language comprehension side, and that love of reading, love of literature maintains its position, because I think it was evident from what the children were saying that they didn't always see it in that way. Okay, so, right. This slide is, I struggled a bit to think of an interactive activity, but this is me being curious. It's often said that there's a consensus now that phonics should be part of early reading. I'm sure there is, but there's lots of nuance within that, isn't there, about what part phonics should play within early reading. So I'm curious about what people's views actually are. So we'll see what people say. And I know that a lot of people will probably think, well, what I think is slightly in between one of these, but you know, I know it's hard for academics, especially to not be too nuanced about what they're thinking, but try and just think which one's closest. Okay. I wonder, I'm thinking that's probably just about where most people have probably put their answers in. That's really interesting, because, you know, when you read in so many papers that everyone agrees now that phonics should be part of it, and here we've got 46% of people, and I presume if people are saying it may or may not include phonics, what you're really saying is it should be up to the teacher. So I'm assuming that that's probably what most people are thinking. And then lots of people think balanced approach with phonics is a fully integrated element, and very few people with phonics as a discrete element. Very interesting. Okay. Right, that's the end of my presentation. So there were lots of references throughout. So the references are all here on the end slides if anybody's interested in following any of those up. But yes, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions.
Thanks ever so much, Liz. That was really interesting. It's great to get children's views of their education. It's quite often overlooked, the children's views, so it's good to get like a detailed perspective from their point of view. So we've actually got about 5 minutes now if anyone would like to ask Liz any questions about her research that she carried out with 24 children, I think you said, across 7 groups, 3 different schools, using the mosaic approach. I was really interested in that slide where you had the different research instruments you used as part of the mosaic approach. So I don't know if anyone wants to ask her a little bit more about that or have any questions at all about the research.
Yeah, I probably gave myself too much to do with all of those different research instruments, but I felt it was really important because children don't always respond the first time you ask them. You know, I needed to get to know them, build up the rapport, but also some of them respond more to a visual stimulus. Some of them responded more when I asked them to do some writing by themselves. Some of them preferred the kind of group discussion activities. So it really gave all children over the course of the research that I did a chance to have their voice heard. I hope, anyway, that was the idea.
So we're getting quite a lot of questions coming up here, and if we can't answer them all, we can go back to them at the very end of this morning's webinar. But Andrew Davis is asking this question, Liz. Did you get views from any children who had started school already able to read? And do you think children are right to see phonics as conceptually distinct from reading, even if it's an essential tool in learning to read? So there's 2 parts there. Did you get views from children who'd started school already able to read? And this idea that children see phonics as separate from reading.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the first question is easy to answer. The answer is, I honestly don't know. I deliberately didn't even go into how, you know, where children were up to in terms of their reading. I said to the teachers, I don't even want to know that, because I just want to speak to the children and find out what they're saying about it, rather than having anything else. So I don't know, that wasn't part of what I was looking at. The second part, what was it again? Oh yeah, are they right to see it as conceptual? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I wondered that. Does it matter? Does it really matter if children don't understand that phonics is part of reading? Or, you know, are they right to see it as conceptually different? I think that because, you know, with my teacher hat on, what I want to do is for children all to learn to read. You know, I had, as a teacher, and I still have, a 100% commitment for all children learning to read, and anything that can help with that, you know, I'm all for it. But I think that we know, don't we, with metacognition, that actually we want children to understand what they're learning and why they're learning it. So actually understanding why they're learning phonics is quite important. And there's no doubt that in the way that reading is currently taught in school, that it is phonics is part of reading. So if that is the case, then children need to see that integration. That's not to say that some people wouldn't argue that actually it shouldn't be taught in that way at all, and then you're onto a whole different question. So this is really about children's experiences of the current policy enactment.
I think we've got a couple more minutes, so maybe you'd like to answer Maria Howarth's question. And Maria has asked whether you've confirmed already that a child who is good at phonics enjoys reading. What about those children who find phonics difficult and are turned off reading very early on? What are the implications about other ways of teaching reading for those children who are turned off phonics very early on?
Yes, well, I mean, this is, in the current policy context, teachers, and this isn't from my research, this is from my talking to colleagues, I know find it very difficult to think about using other methods with children. And early on in the research, I did some discussions with teachers, and I found that there was a bit of difference depending on when the teachers are trained. So teachers that are trained within the last sort of maybe since 2010 tended to very much focus on phonics and decoding as the method. When I said, how do you teach reading? They started talking about phonics, whereas teachers that are trained prior to 2010 seemed to have a much broader view and had more tools in their toolkit to turn to if they felt that phonics wasn't working for a particular child, and referred to that, in fact.
Yeah, interesting. So thank you very much, Liz. I think we're now going to be moving on to the next speakers. So if we can hand over to Annette Woods and Asper Baroutsis. And it's great to welcome a couple of speakers from Australia. I think it's about 7 o'clock in the evening there. Am I right, Annette and Asper?
Yeah, about 7:30. So yes, we're at the other end of the day.
Yeah, good. Well, at least it's not the middle of the night or early in the morning. You haven't had to get up too early. We were a little bit worried about that when we invited you, whether you'd actually be able to make it and do this, take part in this webinar. So I'll hand over to you, and you're both going to talk about public debates about phonics in Australia.
Great, thank you, Barbara. We just wanted to start by saying thanks to Mari and the BERA team, but also to the Literacy and Languages SIG, and of course the other presenters. As you say, Australia's a very long way from many other places, and so no travel has meant that we've had quite different academic lives this year. So it's been quite wonderful to be a part of this. So thank you, and thank you very much to the audience as well for coming in. Asper and I, as we've mentioned, are coming to you from Brisbane. Myself from the University, Queensland University of Technology, and Asper from Griffith University. And it's customary for us in Australia to actually acknowledge that we are standing on the lands of traditional owners. So I will do that before we get started on our presentation. For Asper and I, that means that we are standing on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and we just want to recognise their elders and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future, and just state that these lands were never ceded to the colonial invaders. So I'll move on now to our presentation. So in our presentation, we, perhaps Asper, you might be able to, great, thank you. So in our presentation, we're not actually necessarily wanting to become part of the debates that, you know, seem to be quite, you know, they're recurring. So I've written about this quite a bit, that, you know, about every 5 to 10 years, often when there's some other kind of crisis happening, we get these, you know, recurrence of debates around phonics. And in this paper, you know, whilst we of course have particular positions on that, we're not really wanting to enter into those debates as such. Instead, what we want to do is to use one example of how these types of debates can play out in the media, in this case, particularly social media, and to ask you to kind of think about, you know, what place researchers and educators, teachers and leaders and parents might have in these kinds of debates. So we're asking you to think about, you know, whose voice comes to matter, and what's the political nature of literacy and literacy policy, and how teachers are positioned within these kinds of debates. So just to give you a very, very quick introduction to the Australian context, for those of you who don't know, we had a report similar to the National Reading Panel report back in 2005 by a well-respected educator, Rowe, who talked, or certainly introduced, or it was certainly used to push the notion that we should have more phonics in school. But even though there's, you know, quite a lot of evidence, of course, that there is, you know, a great deal of phonics being taught, particularly in the early years of school. But more recently, as we've seen this debate kind of bubble up again, it actually has been around the Year 1 phonics screening check, which we are borrowing from the UK. And the beginning discussions around this came from the release of a report out of the Centre of Independent Studies, who are the people who research and sell the multi-lit program, the 545 program. And there was a report that came out about a focus on phonics and why Australia should adopt the Year 1 phonics screening test. The debates have continued since that time, particularly on social media, but also being supported by a fairly conservative government that we have at the moment. And then in 2019, we saw a slight shift on that, in that the debates started to rage about what was happening in teacher education, or particularly in initial teacher education. And from the same people, we had a report released, Shortchanged Preparation to Teach Reading to Initial Teacher Education. The claims made in that report are that our teachers are not being taught, our teacher education students are not being taught how to teach reading, and particularly how to teach phonics. And that is, of course, against all evidence that they indeed are. We went into an election in 2019, and our Minister for Education made an election promise to introduce the Year 1 phonics check to all students in Australian schools, and also to amend our national standards for initial teacher education to include more phonics in the programs. Throughout 2020, we have seen that the standards have been shifted. The election promise, we have kind of strange ways of doing government in Australia, in that the federal government doesn't necessarily get to make all decisions about what will happen in schools. That is a state government responsibility. So the phonics check is now available, but it's a voluntary check. It's available on a website, and teachers and parents may access it and engage their children or their students in that test, but it is not mandated as an activity that will happen in every classroom. And we've also kind of seen this slight shift from more teaching phonics to a teaching, a focus on the teaching of reading, including phonics. Many of us have been arguing that the focus purely on reading was short-sighted, and that we certainly need children to also be learning how to write, of course. And we've just very recently, so in the last 2 months or so, seen a shift in some of our more conservative newsprint papers as well, around writing being the new crisis in literacy. So in an attempt to broaden the debate, we've actually seen the debate shift to a different space. So I think I'm still not in control, so perhaps Aspar, thank you. So just 3 really important starting points for us in terms of how we would take our investigation into looking at phonics tests, is that we position ourselves under the notion that all children deserve access to a balanced approach, that a narrow diet of any dimension or element of literacy is not going to be the best possible thing for children. We also want very clearly to state that a singular focus on just print text or reading print text means that children are not being prepared for the lives that they'll head to, that we really need to be engaging children and young people in a full and diverse range of modes. And thirdly, that assessing children isn't going to improve literacy in and of itself. So what teachers are tasked to do is to actually teach children how to read and how to write and view and speak and design. And it's very important that the ways that we do education policy or literacy education policy actually allow us to focus on that. So Aspar, maybe you could click again for me, please. Great. So as we've seen these kinds of shifts from more traditional policy debates, and certainly traditional policy debates in print and news media, so the more traditional media forms, towards social media, what we see kind of is this shift from modes where social participation of the public is quite a bit more difficult in the more traditional modes than it might be within social media. So it's worth kind of knowing that that actually shifts associations between knowledge and who gets to know, and what knowledge gets valued. So there becomes on social media this notion that that the more clicks you get or the more shares you've had, so when quantity actually comes to represent having authority. There's also this shift of association between what evidence is. So what is evidence? Is it opinion? Is it personal experience of one? So I know that this helped my child. Does that then stretch out or link out to it being the best for all children. And there's also this notion that when you are not engaging within that debate, that it's actually can be read as you not having the evidence, or you not having an opinion, or really having nothing to say. So, you know, it does kind of shift how we are able to understand evidence or knowledge, and those that know, who gets to know. So I think we're going to shift now on to our poll. We were very interested to get you thinking about whether you think there is indeed a place for educators and teachers within these debates. Okay, well, it looks like that's not shifting, so I think perhaps we've got our answer there. And now I'm going to hand over to Asper, and she's going to unpack a little bit about how some of those debates play out once we actually move to social media. And I'll ask you to come back to that question about our responsibility to be active within those debates toward the end of our presentation. So thanks, Asper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a few points to make in terms of public debates, particularly on social media. Social media platforms such as Twitter enable the sharing of information and perspectives, and they do contribute to understandings or public understandings of a topic such as phonics. And certainly social media are more inclusive of a range of voices and also perspectives. And that's particularly when compared to, traditional media that do seem to be quite top down. So at least with social media, everyone can have a say, at least in theory. Social networks do support post-factual communication. So post-truth, the era of post-truth does seem to play out on social media platforms. And so it does tend to favor personal opinion, and it does tend to incorporate emotional appeals and appeals to emotions. And that tends to be instead of an evidence-based approach. And so opinions might be expressed passionately or aggressively, or sometimes they do develop into online arguments. Other times the information is expressed quite factually, or sometimes it's expressed with a very obvious slant. And if we're talking about an evidence base, then that raises the question of what evidence and who is delivering that, who is sharing that. So is it my neighbour's daughter's child, or is it a survey of 5,000 participants? And so social media operate within bubbles or echo chambers where followers and people who like and follow a particular social media account basically are like-minded people. And that does tend to magnify a particular perspective. So it's almost like you're playing back your own opinion. So if we could go to the next slide. Yep. So if presenting this one case, it was a 2-week period in November 2017. And as Annette said, in terms of her timeline, it was a significant time period, because there was a lot of discussion about the introduction of the phonics check, and there were those documents that were coming out. And so this was a particular hashtag, and we've decided to withhold the name of the hashtag because it did have an individual's name in it. But basically, we followed it from when it was created. And over that 2-week period, there were 300 posts by 50 users. And what I'm going to show you very soon is a few of the social network diagrams that will show you, the flow of information based on this hashtag. So yeah, 300 posts by 50 users, and you can see there is quite a substantial growth in the number of posts that use this hashtag. So next slide, please. And so these are the four social network diagrams that show pretty much four clusters. So the red cluster, the purple, the blue, and the yellow cluster. And that seems to be where the bulk of the information is coming from related to this hashtag. So the red cluster was someone who self-identified as a phonics advocate. This was in their bio. The other three clusters were closely aligned with the red, the phonics advocate, and the purple cluster on the bottom left, the activist parent and phonics advocate. The blue cluster was a book author and blogger, and the yellow cluster was a psychologist. Now, whereas the other three users did give their actual name, the psychologist chose to withhold their name. And so you can see here that many of the posts that use this hashtag do come from these four clusters. They do seem to dominate the debate, and so the information that comes from them is what is being circulated within this group. And you can also see down the bottom left of each of the diagrams, there are some outliers. And these people are smaller in numbers, and they don't seem to have a strong affiliation with any of the other four clusters. So they just come in, they move in and out of the debates. They were, I can tell you, the ones that were somewhat resist to the approach taken by the other four cluster users. And so this raises the question, as Annette suggested, whose voices are missing in the debates? It clearly is the educators' voices are not there. And so for this hashtag, and for this group of people, phonics really was the only game in town.
So why do we think these sorts of investigations are important? We really think that to understand these debates, it's quite critical to understand these debates if we want to think about how traditional and contemporary media, might be driving certain policy debates. It's really important if we're wanting to challenge unopposed conventional wisdom. I know this worked for my child. And for teachers, we think that it's crucially important if they're going to engage critically in education policy that affects them. So as we move to questions, I guess we'd ask you again to think about, is there a space for teachers within these debates? Thanks for listening.
So hello, and thanks very much, Annette and Asper, for that interesting presentation. I really was fascinated by the images presented as illustrative of the kind of participation from different people in the phonics debate. And we'll just have a look now and see a question for you. We've got a question here from Andrew Davis, who asks, is the Australian phonics debate, especially on social media, as toxic as it's been in England? And why do you think this is? And this is coming from Andrew, who says he's experienced quite significant social media abuse for defending teachers' professional choices over how phonics should be used. So he's really asking, what is the actual phonics debate like in Australia on social media?
Asper, did you want to answer the social media part, and I'll perhaps explain to Andrew why we might be doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, so the interactions, I mean, sure, I guess with social media, you sometimes don't know who you're speaking to, and it could be someone from another part of the world. But yes, the debates are toxic. I think it comes from people being quite passionate about a particular point of view, and go out and share their opinion with as many people who will listen, in the hope that it makes life better for children and young people. I guess it does deteriorate into trolling or nastiness, or it can deteriorate into that sort of thing. Unfortunately, that's a negative to social media. That freedom that we have does sometimes manifest in negative ways.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And it might just be interesting for people to know that the particular period that this analysis came from actually began by an academic putting up a blog post, and the trolling that happened around that on the blog, and then some of the debates moved to social media. And I guess, you know, in answer to why we would be doing these kinds of things, Australia loves to borrow policy or to follow policy from both the UK and the US, and it seems often that as badly as it might be, or the things that might be happening within those contexts, if it's being less effective, we're probably more likely to grab it about 3 to 5 years later. So
interesting. So thank you very much. And we're now actually going to move on to the next presentation. And this presentation is by Robert Wu and Suzanne Graham. They're talking about the effects of teaching phonics and the effects of reading strategies for second language learners of French. So learners of French at post-primary or secondary school level. So over to you, Robert and Suzanne.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thanks so much for the chance to talk to you today about the study which we did recently, which was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it was an experimental study looking at different ways of teaching reading in modern foreign languages, so in secondary schools. So I hope this slightly different perspective is interesting. You know, the learners are older and they're already to a greater or lesser extent literate in English, can read and write in English. But nonetheless, they're beginner readers and writers in the foreign language. Oh, good, the mouse is working, excellent. So just a little bit of background on this context. First of all, as you probably know, we have some problems in MFL with low motivation, declining uptake, and poor attainment relative to perhaps other countries. We have very limited curriculum time, and typically many students don't really seek out input in the language outside of school, so it doesn't create the best conditions for language learning. But we also have felt, and not in all cases obviously, but in some cases, in terms of the teaching of reading, we've been worried that the approach has sometimes been quite unambitious with lots of, or not even lots of, but a predominance of short texts in familiar language, and thereby the topics are rather bland. And so a common topic in year 7 would be what's in my pencil case. And if you compare that with the sort of stuff they're accessing in other subjects, there's just a complete mismatch in terms of the cognitive level, the level of challenge and engagement. And people have argued over quite a long period of time that in MFL kids should be reading stuff which is more interesting for them, you know, more on the same level of maturity and cognitive engagement as they would access in other subjects. And this culminated perhaps in the national curriculum in 2013 saying they should read great literature in the original language. But of course, actually that presents huge challenges in terms of the linguistic level of the texts. So there's a complicated problem there. I've just taken this from the description of the event which we heard at the beginning, that phonics has been accepted as the prime approach for teaching and learning reading. In MFL, that's slightly different. I would say it's not been accepted as the prime approach. And that question, the overall title of today, should phonics be the only game in town? In languages, probably the question is, should it be one of the games in town? And we were looking at that specifically in French. And what we wanted to do really was to strengthen the evidence base that teachers can draw on when teaching reading and early literacy in a foreign language. And I just want to say that we certainly wouldn't want to imply that any of our findings could, you know, tell teachers what to do, or we wouldn't want to say, right, we have the answer. But we did hope that through our study we would enrich the evidence base, because in foreign language studies of foreign language learning, there aren't so many studies in our context, and we think it is quite a distinctive context. So our study had three groups, and ideally we might have had more. We would have loved to have had a business as usual group which didn't have the challenging text, but we didn't have the resources for that. So we had 3 groups, all of whom read challenging texts, and that reflected our desire to get children reading more interesting and engaging stuff in a foreign language so that they could see a purpose for learning to read in the foreign language. And then one group had phonics on top of that, and the other group had strategy instruction on top of that. And so we wanted to see what difference that explicit instruction made over and above any benefits of the text themselves. And we measured a range of outcomes. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go through the rationale for our 2 strands. So the phonics, everyone will be familiar with the simple view of reading and the idea that in the teaching of early literacy in a first language, by learning to sound out words, children can discover their meaning and so have access to their large bank of oral language knowledge. And that's a bit different in MFL, where they meet the written word and start to read at the very same time, typically, as they start learning the language at all. And so there's a quotation here from Graben Stoller, which says, actually, one of the key rationales for phonics teaching is lost in MFL, because even if they sound out a word successfully, they may not know it anyway, so they're none the wiser. We do know that students do actually try to sound out words, but actually, even if they do know those words, if they sound out incorrectly, then that strategy will fail. And we have quite a bit of evidence now that many pupils, obviously not all, but many pupils, if they're not taught phonics in foreign languages, they remain very very inaccurate in their phonological decoding. They don't seem to make a lot of progress, and they seem to just get stuck with reading things in an anglicized way and applying English symbol sound correspondences. We also think there's good reason to think that actually in a foreign language, the benefits of learning to decode might actually go far beyond reading and have a big impact on various other aspects of language learning. And the exciting one for me there is vocab learning, that there's evidence that it has an impact on vocab learning, which is of course central to using the foreign language. But there isn't very much research that we know of that has really explored the effects of phonics teaching in foreign languages. Lots, of course, in L1 and in English, but less in MFL. Okay, strategies. So the rationale for our strategies strand was this sort of quite obviously simple model of reading comprehension as a combination of a student's linguistic knowledge, so the words, the grammar that they know, and then their strategic behavior, their self-regulation, which they might use to make the most of that knowledge or to compensate for gaps in their knowledge. So if they were reading something simple, then their linguistic knowledge might do the bulk of the work and they don't need much strategic behavior. But if they are to read something more challenging, then they'll know less of the language, they might not know so many of the words, and so their strategic behavior will become much more important in compensating for that. So that was the rationale for our second strand. There's been a lot of debate about the value of phonics teaching in MFL, with some people like Michael Swan here arguing it's a waste of time. Don't teach them to compensate for gaps in their language knowledge, just teach them the language and then there won't be the gaps. But actually there have been various systematic reviews and meta-analyses saying that strategy instruction can be a good use of lesson time in reading. But as usual, there's less research in the MFL context. But one study we were aware of and that we knew very well was by our colleagues Ernesto Macaro and Lynn Erler. And this was a quasi-experimental study a few years ago where 3 classes in 3 different schools had some strategy instruction and 3 were a control group. And the strategy group had various advantages in their reading outcomes, their motivation and their strategic behavior. But we did have some questions over the study. First of all, the strategies group, in order to be able to have something to practice on, read challenging texts. The control group didn't. So we wondered, had the texts themselves actually created conditions that allowed these benefits to arise, to blossom? And secondly, one of the strategies that they taught was sounding out. And in order to allow students to do that, they taught some GPC, they taught some French phonics. And so we really wanted to know, can we tease apart the contribution that phonics is making here? So I'll whiz through this one so I don't take too long, but we had 36 schools who were allocated to one of the 3 groups each, and we tested them before and after and a delayed test. And the intervention, they were taught over 5 or 6 months, so between January and May. And just to show you the challenging text, so we created 8 of these for them to use. And these turned out to be one of the most popular, actually they were very popular with both students and teachers. So we tried to cover topics which we thought would be interesting, engaging, so tourist attractions, footballers, music, and typically much longer than students would normally read in year 7 and using more complicated language. And I'm handing over to Suzanne.
Okay, thanks very much, Robert. So I'm going to talk about the main findings quite quickly. So just to talk about how we analysed our data, if I can move on. See, it's not moving on. So if someone could move on the slides for me, I can't seem to move them on. So
I've lost control, so I can't.
Okay, so we focused on times 1 and 2 because we lost lots of students at time 3. And because we had still about 900 students from whom we drew data across the 3 groups equally. And because we had students from different schools, we needed to account for school effects in the analyses. And in our analysis, we focused on the effect of the interventions on reading comprehension at time 2, on phonological decoding at time 2, on vocabulary knowledge, taking account of learners' scores at time 1. We also looked at self-efficacy or confidence in reading. In some of our analyses, we also control for prior academic attainment in general. So next slide, please. Okay, so before we start, I'd like you just to have a prediction, really. What do you think we found, particularly in relation to reading? So which group, if any, or groups, made significantly greater progress in reading comprehension? So if you just want to cast your vote, which are the groups? So the phonics and the strategies groups separately, both groups together, phonics and the text group. Okay, I think the poll's finished as far as I can see. It doesn't seem to be moving anymore. So perhaps if we can move on to, oh no, we can be off again. Okay, are we there? Can we find out? Can we move to the next slide at that point? Okay, so what did we find out? So reading comprehension. At time 1, the groups were more or less equal, but at time 2, very interestingly, there was no statistically significant advantage for any group over the others. So you can see from this graph that all 3 groups made statistically significant progress between times 1 and time 2 with large effect sizes. And we believe that the pedagogical texts themselves may have helped develop reading proficiency for all 3 groups. But of course, because we didn't have a true control group, so a group that didn't read the challenging text, we can't be sure of that. So let's move on to the next slide. And thinking about phonological decoding, again, at time 1, the groups were more or less equal, but at time 2, perhaps as we might expect, there was an advantage for the phonics over the text group that approached significance. And when we did control for learners' general prior attainment, we did indeed find a statistically significant advantage for the phonics over the text group, but we should bear in mind that that didn't include data for all participants. And we should also bear in mind that the test that we used, a paper test of decoding, is probably less sensitive than a reading aloud task. Okay, next slide. Looking at vocabulary, so again, at time 1, groups were more or less equal, but at time 2, there was a significant advantage for the phonics over the text group. And when we controlled for prior attainment, we also found an advantage for both the phonics and the strategies group over the text, but particularly for the phonics group with a larger effect size. And you can see that quite clearly on this graph here. Next slide. So all groups made progress in vocabulary between times 1 and times 2, but as we've just seen, that the effect sizes were much bigger for the phonics group than for the text group, and also bigger than the strategies group. So the phonics instruction had the most positive impact on vocabulary knowledge. Next slide. Looking at self-efficacy, learners' confidence in being able to read challenging texts, again, all groups made significant progress between times 1 and times 2, but the biggest improvement was for the strategies group, followed by the phonics group, then the text. At time 2, no group had a significant advantage once we'd control for school, but when we control for prior attainment again, there was a significant advantage for the strategies over the text group with all the provisos that we've already mentioned. And in subsequent analysis that we've since done, which I won't talk about here in great detail, we have indeed found that actually for certain kinds of learners, there are advantages for self-efficacy from receiving strategy instruction for reading comprehension. Next slide. Next slide. So what can we conclude for all that? So I think our main conclusion really is that we should really be raising the expectations that the kind of written text that beginner learners of French can and probably should read in Year 7, and that they can read engaging, interesting texts that not only promote several aspects of reading development, but are also liked by learners. And so there may be benefits for linguistic and motivational development over and above what is found with traditional reading materials. And we would agree with this quotation here, that if we want children to get better at reading and to do more of it, we need to give them an attractive, nutritious and satisfying diet. And the last slide, I believe. So I think our conclusion is that phonics isn't the only game in town, probably, but that an integrated approach to French reading instruction that combines strategies and phonics explicit instruction, but also challenging, engaging text is likely to be more beneficial than any approach in isolation. And we conclude that because all 3 groups made significant progress in reading French, and we believe that came from the challenging texts themselves. At the same time, there were advantages for the phonics group, for phonological decoding, advantages in vocabulary for the phonics and the strategies group, but particularly for the phonics group, and advantages for strategies instruction groups in terms of strategic behavior and self-efficacy. And bringing those things together is likely to engage learners and give them linguistic knowledge, strategic proficiency, and resilience to keep on reading. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So thanks very much, Robert and Suzanne. Really interesting to hear your research about this intervention you put in place in quite an impressive number of schools, actually 36 schools across England, I think you said, in order to address this kind of issue we have in secondary schools in England, kind of low motivation and unambitious teaching of reading. So if anyone's got any questions for Robert or Suzanne, please feel free to post them. Let's just have a look here. Katie Wilshire is asking a question here. It's quite an open question, this one, so you might want to both think about it. Do you think that the principles of phonics teaching should be part of the initial teacher training curriculum for all secondary PGCE students? So she's opening that out to look at all PGCE students, not just those that teach modern foreign languages.
I don't know who wants to answer that. Robert, do you want to answer that?
Well, I can answer it from an MFL perspective first and foremost. and we do include phonics in our PGCE course.
And do we?
I do think it's important. I think the evidence says that many students don't learn to decode accurately, certainly not fluently, without that help. And I do think it's really important. And I think if you get learners who are in sort of year 11 or even year 12 who are struggling to decode text, they feel themselves like beginners. They are reminded of when they were at primary school, stumbling over words, and they feel like beginners. And I think it has a massive impact on their motivation. So we do include it in our MFL PGCE. But I'm not sure I want to talk about all other subjects.
I suppose there's possibly a difference between primary and secondary initial teacher education. I mean, I think for secondary initial teacher education, I think it would be helpful for teachers of all subjects to at least be aware of the principles of it. And I think, I mean, certainly on our PGCE course, it is an issue that is discussed, I think, as a whole course concern, really, that all teachers are reading in some way or another.
Just another question that's come in as well. Liz is asking whether you think the actual language that the students are learning and you're teaching, does that make a difference in terms of the use of phonics or not? In that some might be more phonetic than others?
I mean, certainly some languages are more transparent and others are more opaque, and certain languages are more problematic for speakers of English as a first language. So French is particularly problematic, but there are differences in all languages, really. It is an issue in all languages, I would say. Robert, would you agree?
No, I do. I mean, we did that in French because it's a particular challenge in French, because French has, it's difficult for learners. But I would also advocate the teaching of phonics in Spanish, which is much more transparent or shallow, and German, because that influence of English, using the same alphabet as English, that influence of English is still there, and there's still that tendency to read things as if they're English. I suppose they have massive input in English all the time, and so we're fighting the tide.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think they still do need it in those languages, but I think it's quicker and easier to teach in Spanish and German. I think there's less to cover and it can be done more quickly.
Okay, well, thank you both for that presentation. And we'll now move on to our final presenter, Dr. Janet Soler from the Open University. And Janet is going to be talking to us about the commodification of phonics, looking especially at early years literacy and really exploring that idea that it's a big commercial business. So over to you, Janet.
Hello. I'd like to say thank you very much, Barbara, and as the co-convener of the Literacy SIG, I'd like to say kia ora to my, and as a New Zealander by birth, I'd like to say kia ora to my Antipodean colleagues as well, even though I'm over here, based in England. this here, and specifically in relation to literacy. And I think maybe but last but not least, and perhaps the most important question I wanted to ask is, whose interests are being served in relation to the early years literacy policy and practice? Next slide, please. Oh, the next slide. Oh, yeah. So what I wanted to, as a background, I'm interested in studies that have looked at the neoliberal policy turn, and I'm particularly interested in how these studies might give us some kind of way of analysing the policy context that have led to the dominance of phonics in the teaching of reading in New Zealand. I think there is a general background to this. Ball and Udall have done, and people will be aware of their work, I'm sure, Stephen Ball's work, so well known. In 2007, they argued, and they show, their book, it's a very interesting book, showed the adoption of how the adoption of neoliberalism led to the growth of privatisation, how it led to ideas and practices from the private sector, leading to schools becoming more market orientated and business-like. And I want to show you in the rest of this presentation some of the kind of evidence I'm seeing of that happening. The everyday funding of schools have become heavily affected by this trend, as Lord has argued, as early as 1999. And what I think is what most is interesting about it is that this has actually been described as a shift in emphasis from a social democratic market to managerial norms. And I was interested in the other presenters, particularly Liz's, looking at performativity, the dominance and the perception of performativity, because that's one of the things that research in this area shows is particularly linked to a dominance of managerial norms. So also over the last decade, there's been as everybody's probably aware, there's been a growing privatisation in England, and there's been an opening up of the public education services to private sector participation. But I don't think that this has been particularly well looked at, and particularly in terms of literacy and particularly in terms of phonics. So this is what I want to do in this paper. And people looking at it in other areas have argued that this policy in turn influenced the adoption of early literacy programs in 1990s and 2000s. And I looked at this earlier in my earlier work with Roger Openshaw from New Zealand in our earlier book, and I've looked at it in subsequent presentations and papers that I've been working on. Can we have a new slide? So I think an important question to ask is, how has it changed what we think of education and literacy achievement? And it seems to be a lot of the research generally of the impact of privatisation and dominance of business discourses within education have been in terms of achievement. And as I'll show you some examples, but I think this is also there is evidence of this occurring in the media discourse and in terms of the evidence on the internet, which is the two sources I've been looking at in depth. So there are links between the ascendancy of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s, with it's got an emphasis on new public management. It is argued that led to a new mode of regulation and form of governmentality. And the work Mark Olson and Michael Peters wrote it's been quite an influential paper in educational policy, which argued that there was actually that strong connection. What I wanted to do, and the basis of this work, is I'm drawing on a Foucauldian analysis, like Olson and Peters do, to look at neoliberalism in terms of the central assumptions linked to the rise of this period and how it can be seen to be linked to the use of markets as a new technology to control and enhance particularly performance in the public sector. And I'm looking at performance in terms of reading in education. I think it raises, for those of you in the audience, I know we have a number of early years educators that are attending this seminar. I think I wanted to specifically ask, what are the consequences for early years educators? So in this paper, my investigation of the particularly of the internet sources and the media using analysis using Nexus Lexis specifically, I argue that the inherent states of being which neoliberalism rests upon, including depoliticisation, individualisation and financialisation, are central to the way the reading wars have been enacted and situated in public debates and professional discourses since the 1990s in England. So I think that's interesting also because I'm noting, particularly in terms of some of the earlier presentations, the kind of emphasis on individualism, on decoding is happening within the individual mind rather than the emphasis that appears to be occurring or evident so much now in terms of social connectiveness and reading being a social practice. I'm also interested in the way that the impact of the commodification of reading might be undermining ideals embodied with, or might be linked to, and deprofessionalisation and commodification of early literacy teaching. And again, I'm going to show some specific examples of that I found of this happening. I think. So in terms of the evidence I've looked at, I started looking at the rise of the period when the coalition, we had a coalition government here in England, the Cameron government, 2010, 2011, where we saw a really growth and emphasis on phonics. Prior to that, it was more of a mixed methods approach. And that was, of course, advocated strongly by Gibb and Michael Gove. And linked to that was also an increasing, and you can see it tracing through the media discourse and tracing through the internet presence. There was a rise in the presence of Read Write Inc. and the director Ruth Miskin, and that was covered in the media, particularly in the left-wing media here and in the Guardian. They were reported as having built a profitable career on designing reading resources and training for schools, and there has been quite a bit of comment on how that an industry has been built on the back of phonics. It's also been reported that that in 2012, it was also reported that there were worries about synthetic phonics being overemphasised, and that the developers and commercial producers of phonics-based material have been advising and acting as experts, which benefit them financially. And again, that's commentary from Mansell in The Guardian. At the time, and even as early as 2011, 2012, I found the media, from my searches in the media, it was quite evident that people were starting to ask questions about this commodification, about the links between phonics and the commodification of reading programs. And particularly people were asking who gains and at whose expense. So the gains from the funding regime, there were comments by Mansell in The Guardian again that there were particular gains for those who had commercial interests in the phonics programs. And Mansell argues that at this point in 2012, Mansell argued that new questions have arisen relating to perhaps the most controversial of ministerial advisors, Ruth Miskin, an expert on the teaching of phonics who has built a successful business career on designing reading resources and training for schools. Miskin operates a company that has developed training for her own set of phonics teaching resources, which qualifies for a Department of Education subsidy of up to £3,000 per school, £3,000 per school. And in the paper, I go into this in more depth and how this actually worked and how schools benefited from signing up to the Read Write Inc. program. So in 2012, in those early years from the coalition period, when the Conservative government got into power or came into power here in England and the UK, we had already a beginning, an increasing discourse around commodification and increasing evidence that this was happening and that there were some concerns being expressed. So I've also, in tracing this through, and I thought I'd give you some examples, some contemporary examples of where we're at in terms of the discourses and the languages how this language, I wanted to show this because I wanted to show how the actual language associated with the commodification shapes the way that we think about reading, and how that shapes the policies, and in turn shapes the way that we as a profession view reading, and we as a profession are engaged in reading. So I was interested to find this example. This is called About Phonics Bear, and this was I'm asking the question, are early years phonics programs becoming a big business opportunity? And I saw there are a number of examples I've found on the internet like this. So this is Annette Frith, who's arguing, and it's interesting because she's talking about nursery phonics, but she's also talking about delivering by our team of growing franchisees. So it's interesting how the language is shifting from the early years. And of course, I did train in the 70s and 80s, and working in literacy, and the notions we had when I trained in programs like Reading Recovery, of the professional, of the teacher, how that's now moving towards the deliverers being the enfranchisees. Also, I think one of the other kind of discourses that's changes I'm seeing in the discourses when I'm looking at the media is that that there's also, and this fits with the literature looking at commodification, neoliberalism, and how things grow, and how business impacts upon areas in education and in the public sector, and that is the notion of the teacher as an early childhood entrepreneur. And I didn't see it in the 2012 literature I've looked at so far. It seems to be, from what I can see, kind of tracing the discourse through, particularly in internet sites like this. It seems to be becoming very, very predominant. And you can franchise with Phonics Bear. You can become a franchiser. The rhetoric is very much about the educator being an entrepreneur, and selling the program within literacy and engagement. They are talking about teaching, but it's engagement. The other kind of discourse I'm seeing emerging both in the media and in the internet, across the internet, that I've been looking at, is that the privatisation, there's a sort of very much a discourse about the privatisation and selling of literacy as improvement. The emphasis seems to be very much on literacy programs, and it's about improvement. And this is from Sophie Cooper's site on the internet. She says she's an experienced school teacher and a founder of readwithphonics.com, which is another business opportunity she has created, and she couches herself as an entrepreneur. As a primary teacher for year one pupils, I saw the impact that how learning has to read on children's education, and it amazed me. Reading is the most vital skill of all in education. There is a reason why it's the first thing you learn when you start school. You simply cannot progress without it. Yet 1 in 7 children lack basic literacy skills, but there's no evidence, she doesn't present any evidence to say that it's given as common sense knowledge that literacy were declining, and that phonics, a program such as hers, can address this. Finally, I think there's an entrepreneur, as well as creating teachers and educators, literacy educators, phonics educators through phonics programs as entrepreneurs. There's also the idea of entrepreneurial localities. So the school is a learning setting, but it's also an entrepreneurial opportunity and an entrepreneurial locality where you can where the program plays out, and there's it's a chance to use words are used like products, and so a resource becomes a product. The teachers and the teachers, I don't know if she's talking that's the students so much, but the teachers particularly become customers. So it's a real shift, I'm arguing, in terms of discourse coming about through a commodification of an increasing commodification of phonics programs. So I'm going to conclude, and I'm not taking a poll because I think these questions are a bit difficult to have yes or no answers to, but I'm raising questions I think are coming out of this that I'm now grappling with, and I'd be interested to in any other comments that you might have. Questions like, how is the rise and dominance of phonics linked to ongoing commodification of early years literacy programs? I'm arguing it's in this paper that it tightly is, but I'd be interested in your views, and the other issues I've listed there, like the selling of private company services, whose interests are being served, and basically, I suppose the final question that I think is important, is there a benefit from all? Is there a benefit for all, not just for the entrepreneurs, but for the teaching profession and for educators from the privatisation of early years literacy programs, such as particularly phonics?
Thanks very much, Janet, for that interesting presentation. And we'll just go to see if we have any questions for you here. Excuse me. Andrew Davis comments that Margaret Clark in England used a freedom of information request to get data about money earned by the Department for Education approved commercial phonics providers. So she was trying to find out, you know, how much money they were earning by being approved by the Department for Education. Apparently huge sums of money were earned by a number of people, one of whom helped create the national curriculum programs of study for reading. And he would just like your comments on this.
Yeah, I've talked to Margaret Clark about this, and yes, I think it's really interesting. I've found a number of websites that did indicate certain things, but actually gaining the evidence is difficult in terms of the methods I'm using. It does seem to me, in terms of looking at the media and in terms of looking at the change of discourse and looking at the kind of the websites I've been showing you, that it's very much worth following that up and looking at. And I do think, I don't know what other people think, but I do think if there's conflicts of interest and if there's you know, mixed interests, I think it's a very important question for us as professionals to ask. And yes, I think we need more research into that area, I suppose, is my quick answer.
You also mentioned in your presentation this kind of tension between kind of social approach to reading, that reading is something which can happen in a social situation, and the tension between that and phonics, which stresses a kind of individual approach to reading. I just wondered if you'd just like to expand on that a little bit.
I think I did. I have done earlier papers, and I think there's a key difference between, I'm just using the two key programs I'm most familiar with, which is Reading Recovery and the phonics-based programs. And it is, yes, they are also the New London School and social cultural approaches. I think, yes, Reading Recovery does look at and works with the individual, like a lot of programs do, and a lot of people would argue, and SENCOs would argue, is necessary. But I think there's a key difference in terms of the choice of reading material. The Donald Holdaway big books that took off when I was working in New Zealand and become worldwide quite important, seems to me to be a very different approach to the approaches that Liz was describing, where it's very much on individual attainment and achievement. And I am aware too, from my historical work, because I did for earlier work and for my doctorate, trace the whole kind of the development of reading from 1900 as part of the English curriculum in New Zealand through to the 1950s. And it's clear when you look back at the 1900s and the 1920s and even up to the 30s and 40s, reading as decoding, reading as a particular skill was not particularly influential. That the emphasis, particularly in the 20s, was on diction, on speaking. It was much more like Matthew Arnold's idea of becoming the literate English person. Yeah, and so I think while that has moved forward from the 50s through, what I would argue, what I'm seeing now is a stronger and stronger emphasis on individual achievement and decoding of text. Even in the material I'm looking at for this paper.
Thanks, Janet. And Liz comments as well that maybe it's the lack of transparency which is the most problematic with this issue around phonics. Transparency around, what are we using it for? Is it really just about because it's easy to measure? Is that one of the main reasons? Is it that it's adopted, or is it really because it's effective in teaching reading?
I think the literature on neoliberal and the literature and work like Stephen Ball's points to the fact that maybe that probably is the case. But I do think that we need more. I know we need work into how it works within the educational setting, but I would argue that we do need work that looks at in terms of more broader policy implications and social equity, social justice issues at a policy level, as well as our classroom-based research, which is I think why we wanted to run this session, wasn't it, Barbara?
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for some really interesting insights into the world of phonics, and it's prompted us all, I think, to think about how we use phonics in our own working context, and maybe the best way forward with this. So I'd just like to hand over again now to the delegates. You've got the opportunity to ask the panel a few more questions. So let's just see if we have any questions for any of the presenters. Okay, I'm just having a look here at a few of the questions. There's a question here from Lucy Henning, who's saying she'd like to thank you for the fascinating and very valuable research, but asks the question, if we are aiming for children to see reading as fun and engaging, should we emphasize texts that young children want to read? Is there an overemphasis on what adults perceive as high quality literature? So that's a question on the type of texts that we're encouraging young children to read, and this tension between what they want to read and high quality literature. I don't know if anybody would like to try and respond to that question. I know that Robert and Suzanne, you were looking at the type of challenging texts that motivated your secondary school learners. I don't know if you can comment on that debate between, the sort of literature we think they should be reading and the sort of thing that actually motivates.
Liz, you had your hand up, but do you want to go first and then I'll follow?
Yeah, absolutely fine. So yeah, I think, was it Lucy? I think you said, Barbara. I think that's a really fascinating point that Lucy's making, and it's really interesting that actually, if you look at the kind of playoff between content of what children are reading and whether or not they have a choice over it, actually content comes out higher than choice does. So children reading what they want to read, whether or not we kind of help them to choose it, guide them towards it, help them to make those decisions, or whether it's totally free choice, but reading what they want to is really very important. And certainly I've always been a firm advocate of, I'm always against dichotomies, not one or the other, but actually children need both, don't they? They need to be introduced to texts that they might not otherwise read, and to have their minds open, stretched, inspired, all of those things that we want to do. But at the same time, they also need access to comics and, packets and all of that. And the one boy was telling me that he really wanted to learn to read because he wanted to read his dad's building books. His dad had these, dad was a builder, and he wanted to be able to read those books, and he couldn't yet. So yeah, I think the role of children having access to all sorts of different literature is really important, and you're right to remind us of that.
Robert, do you have a response as well?
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. And I suppose a criticism of what we did was that we created those texts. I mean, we did do that in collaboration with all the teachers who took part, but we did choose those and we wrote them. And so there wasn't that element of choice. But having said that, they were very popular with students and teachers. But we're doing a thing at the minute actually. It's not reading, but we're trying to get children to watch YouTube resources in foreign languages, something they might be able to do even if they're in lockdown. And we have got, at the minute, they're being piloted, and we're asking, again, we've located them because we had to make sure they were accessible. So we've tried to locate resources which are composed of around the 2,000 most frequent words in French. But then we're asking students to pilot it to rate them. And so we're going to see which come out as the most popular and disseminate those. But it's very hard because some of the things they'd want to read in a foreign language would be too hard. And so this is an added complication, I think.
I mean, if I could just add, I think choice is important because it is really hard to know what children would like. I mean, what one child would like, another wouldn't. You know, we found that in other projects that texts that have been really popular with some, but absolutely hated by others. So actually giving a choice, you know, is essential, isn't it, really?
Okay, so back to some of the other questions here. Des Hewitt poses quite an interesting question. I'm not sure which one of you might like to respond, but he asks, how do children on the autistic spectrum learn to decode? I don't know if Liz, if in your project you came across any younger children who were on the ASD spectrum at all, and whether you picked up any of their views on reading.
Yeah, actually there was one child, and that child seemed to be on a very similar journey to other children, and that child actually, I mean, yeah, decoding was what it was all about for that particular child, and the child was very, very interested in telling me about the letters that he knew, and you know, was able to describe them to me, wanted to show them to me. So he was able to do that, but it was very much about decoding. So what I would say, this only applies to one child, is that my findings were writ large in that particular child.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from Joe Dobb, who's asking whether you were able to identify the extent to which each of the schools felt that they were encouraging and supporting reading for pleasure, and whether this was reflected in any way through the children's comments and feelings. I think that's addressed to your project again, Liz, about whether the schools felt they were encouraging and supporting reading for pleasure, and whether it was reflected in the children's comments.
Yes, they all did. But it wasn't particularly reflected in the children's comments. And that was what was so interesting to me, because when I spoke to the teachers informally at the start of the research, you know, I was quite impressed by what a lot of the teachers were saying. It was, you know, a very sort of full programme in all of the schools, very much following sort of current policy, but doing other things as well. But the message the children were getting, that the children seemed to be hearing, was it's all about phonics and it's all about your proficiency in decoding. And that was what was so interesting. And that you know, what I'd like to do next, once I finish this, is go back into school and do a bit more of an in-depth look at what's actually happening in school. So what are the experiences that children are having? You know, why are they experiencing reading as phonics and decoding when these other things are, you know, by teacher's word, happening as well. So yeah, I mean, they were all schools that we work with regularly for teacher training purposes. They're all sort of, you know, schools, good schools. Yeah, so it was the message the children were getting seemed to be different from that the teachers thought that they were giving.
Okay, thank you, Liz. So this is a question from Emily Roberts Tyler, and she asks whether the panelists can see a future where we can all come together to agree on what balanced literacy could look like, that allows for good quality systematic phonics instruction, as well as all the other important aspects of reading and broader literacy. Do you think there's going to be a time when there's agreement on this and what components actually make up aspects of reading and the broader literacy idea?
I'm happy to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, I do think we had a more balanced view when looking at the National Literacy Strategy and the mixed methods. And I think then what I was looking at my research, it's moved much more towards phonics here in England under the coalition and then subsequent Conservative government. So I think my argument would be that to a large extent, policy has driven what we can do in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And if we don't, I think we do need to be cognizant of educators and as teachers of policy above us and what's happening. It is important because I've worked with a lot of teachers and say, well, what you look at, Janet, isn't really that relevant to me as a teacher. But I would argue it is, and that we probably won't be able to affect change to that direction to any great extent if it doesn't happen at a policy level as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a question here which our two presenters from Australia, Annette and Asper, may wish to respond to. Let me just think here. Yeah, Katie Wilshire asks, is it a concern that Twitter, for example, is poorly regulated and that by engaging in debate in certain types of social medium that we're beginning to kind of feed a beast?
You go, Asper.
Yeah, yes, I think I know of colleagues who are quite prominent in education debates around phonics, but also beyond. And they have made decisions to not enter the debates because of the toll it takes on them and the some of the outcomes that they find are part of it. There have been colleagues that have, received really bad treatment when they put their ideas out there. And I guess, as academics, we're used to having this peer review process. There is an anonymity involved there, but it is, on the whole, it's polite and civilized. And sometimes when you go beyond that, the social media platforms, that civility tends to exit the debate, and there are personal attacks and deriding comments and criticisms that come across as very personal. So I know of many people who have decided to stay quiet, and that has consequences. If we all decide to stay quiet, then only one perspective or only a couple of perspectives are getting out there. And so, it makes you wonder what the wider community is then picking up about, say, the phonics debate or other debates. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Asper.
I would also add, Barbara, that while we all might make our own individual decisions about whether we will play on mediums like Twitter or not, we also don't want to be led down that that's the only place where you can play or where you can be involved in these debates. So choosing not to engage on Twitter doesn't, I think, mean that we shouldn't be engaging in, in policies, in debate, in whatever forums are possible, and whether that's, in policy debates or with politicians, or whether it's in traditional media, or indeed with our own students and our own, families and those who are around us. So, if we're in schools, the parents and actually demonstrating that as educators or academics, teachers, leaders, we have something to say. We actually do understand this area, rather than, perhaps thinking, well, I don't want to go on Twitter, so really, there's nowhere else I can be. There are lots of places where we can still be and where we can still actually demonstrate our expertise. So I think that's really important, particularly if we're choosing not to be on those forums.
Okay, thank you. There's another question coming in about your presentation, Liz. And Claire Woods is wondering how many of the children were from reading homes where others are engaged for reading for pleasure in their home. in that parental influence and kind of literacy and what's happening in the home will always impact on the children's views. Did you have a chance to look at that in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, because of course children are not just being influenced by what's happening in school. What's happening in the home is also hugely influential, in some cases more so, and that's been shown by multiple research studies. Yeah, I mean, in my discussions with the children, I was able to pick up the extent to which they were reading at home, to which they had books at home. You know, some children talked about visits to the library with members of their family, whereas other children told me they had no books at home. So reading their school reading book to them was very precious, because that was the only book that they had. So I think that the influence of that was clear, but it wasn't always a one-to-one correspondence with how they then felt about phonics and reading. It was really interesting how children's views varied still within that and shifted over time as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I think we'll just end on a more general question here. Well, actually, before I ask this last general question, there are a number of other questions we won't have time to answer, but I think they'll be sent to the presenters, and the presenters can then get back to the delegates that have asked the question. But to end with this very general question, Terry Pearson is asking, what do the presenters think of the view of Professor Geoffrey Bowers, who's from the University of Bristol? He says that despite widespread consensus in the research community, there is a shortage of empirical evidence to suggest that simply teaching phonics leads to better outcomes, to better reading outcomes. So I'll just say that again, that despite widespread consensus in the research community, there is a shortage of empirical evidence to suggest that simply teaching phonics leads to better reading outcomes.
I'll go first. Oh no, sorry, Annette, you go.
Thank you. So I guess I'd start with the question and just say I'm not sure that there's actually a consensus amongst researchers that phonics is the way to go. I think there's quite a consensus between a very large number of researchers that having a more balanced approach where children are, you know, taught about comprehension, about making meaning, about grammar, about, you know, critical literacy or how texts influence different things, as well as the full scope of skills. You know, phonics isn't the only skill that young children or all children need in order to learn to read. So I guess I would suggest that there's not consensus that it is the only way, but I certainly would agree that there is not the full body of research or empirical research to say that it is the only way to teach children to read. Sorry, Liz, thank you. Would else
like to respond to that?
Yes, I've looked at in depth at Mike Gibb and Michael Gove and Gibb's response to phonics, because this whole debate came up with the coalition government here in England in 2010, and I was quite astounded looking through the examples they were giving. They did cite research, but it seemed to me, I would argue it was very much, and I have argued in papers I've been working or published, that it was cherry picking to a large extent. It did not seem to me, looking at going through and looking quite detailed, the kind of research they were using to support their strong move away from mixed methods to phonics. I did not think it was that representative of all of the debate, and I would agree that the debate seemed to me to be largely agreed that we need mixed methods. Not that we don't need phonics, but that we need mixed methods.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Yeah. I think now it's time just to say final thank you to everybody. A big thank you to all our speakers, Janet, Annette, Asper, Liz, Robert and Suzanne. You've come together today for provide us with a really interesting debate and lots of food for thought going forwards when we're thinking about using phonics in our workplace setting. And also a big thank you to all the delegates out there who've tuned into this BERA webinar this morning, and I really hope that you've enjoyed it. So thanks to everybody involved, and especially to the BERA administrators who've held together this online webinar. Great, thank you all, and go off and have a great day wherever you are.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.